April 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing, yet on a damp spring morning the sound of boots still echoed against muddy earth. A column of women, their uniforms mismatched and frayed, marched under guard into a fenced enclosure outside a small American camp. The barbed wire shimmered with dew. Watchtowers creaked as guards shifted their weight. For the women, many of them auxiliary staff or nurses swept up in surrender, this was the first moment of captivity. They clutched belongings in bread sacks, faces stiff with uncertainty, waiting for what they had been told would be cruelty. The first impression was not hunger or exhaustion, but silence. American soldiers stood at intervals, rifles slung casually, not barked against their shoulders. A jeep rattled past with a stack of crates marked with the Geneva Red Cross, each stenciled box an unfamiliar symbol of order. Some of the women exchanged nervous looks. The propaganda they had consumed for years had painted Americans as brutes, eager to humiliate, exploit, and destroy. Instead, the guards only gestured, directing them toward long tar-paper barracks. Estimates suggest that by war's end, over 11,000 female German POWs were in Allied custody, though records often blended them into the wider total of 425,000 German prisoners in America alone. These women represented not an army, but fragments of a collapsing regime. Clerks, radio operators, camp auxiliaries, nurses. To them, every step through the mud was supposed to confirm their indoctrination, that capture meant shame. Yet they found Americans looking at them more with curiosity than vengeance. One prisoner later recalled that first entry as a strange calm. She expected barking, blows, and starvation. Instead, she saw a cook fire spitting steam near the mess tent and heard the faint laughter of guards trading cigarettes. The barbed wire was real, but the menace behind it was missing. It was the beginning of a slow, destabilizing realization that defeat did not mean annihilation. The prisoners tried to settle into their bunks, boots still damp, wool skirts heavy with mud. The air smelled of canvas, tar, and faint coffee carried on wind from the kitchen. They whispered in disbelief, "This is not how enemies treat enemies." But they did not yet know the true surprise awaiting them, because the real shock was not in fences or food, but in something smaller, folded pieces of paper carried in the guards' breast pockets. And that is where the story begins to twist, when abundance gave way to intimacy. The second morning inside the camp broke with the hiss of kettles and the metallic clang of mess tins. From their barracks, the women smelled something alien: coffee. Not the scorched barley substitute they had known in Germany, but real beans, ground and boiled until the steam rolled over the wire. They shuffled out into the yard and stopped short. Trucks were backing in, brakes squealing, their beds stacked with wooden crates marked with the red and white emblem of the Geneva Cross. The guards, young Americans barely older than some of the captives, worked without urgency, tossing each crate onto a growing pile. Canvas straps snapped, nails squealed, and soon mountains of parcels towered just inside the compound. Each box carried the promise of sugar, chocolate, canned milk, and cigarettes. To women who had survived on watery soups and potato peels, the sight was staggering. Records show that single shipments sometimes delivered over 24,000 Red Cross parcels to large POW camps. Each one weighed around 11 pounds and contained not only food, but small luxuries, instant coffee, jam, soap, and even playing cards. In a Europe strangled by shortages, this was wealth in wood and paper. One German woman whispered to another, "Our own men never had this much, not even on the front." The abundance carried its own kind of shock. Nazi propaganda had told them that capture meant hunger and humiliation. Yet here, the enemy seemed to hand out comforts their own officers had hoarded. For many, it was a dangerous revelation that the Reich's promises were thinner than the soup they had survived on. The sound of crowbars cracking open crates became in its own way louder than artillery. But the parcels were only the beginning. While food dulled hunger, something else would soon pierce deeper than any ration. That second morning, as guards passed cigarettes between themselves and POWs sniffed the sweetness of chocolate bars, a woman noticed an envelope tucked into a soldier's pocket. He smiled at the paper as though it were a secret flame. She realized then that the true abundance was not in coffee or parcels, but in words carried from far away. The camp smelled of food, but it was letters that would soon reshape loyalties. Evening settled on the camp, with the low hum of generators and the crackle of radios spilling swing music through thin wooden walls. The female prisoners gathered near their bunks, listening to the faint rhythm, when another sound caught them. Muffled laughter drifting from the guardroom. They edged closer to the window slats and saw a group of American soldiers hunched around a lantern, cigarette smoke curling upward in lazy rings. In their hands were not dice or whiskey bottles, but folded envelopes. Each man opened his letter with deliberate care, some smoothing creases, others pressing a kiss to the page before reading aloud. The POWs traded looks. It was strange to see enemy soldiers break into wide smiles, shoulders loosening, as though the war had lifted. One guard slapped the back of another, chuckling at a line from home. Their voices softened when they reached passages about mothers, wives, or girls waiting in small American towns. Statistics underline the scale of this lifeline. In 1945 alone, the U.S. military postal system handled roughly 1.6 billion pieces of mail, an industrial effort that stretched across oceans and continents. Even in the heart of battle, letters moved faster than artillery shells. To the women watching, the envelope seemed more potent than rations, proof that every soldier here had someone thinking of him far beyond the wire. A German nurse whispered, "Why laugh at paper?" She could not understand how flimsy sheets could light up hardened men. In her world, letters from the front had carried only dread, notifications of death, propaganda speeches disguised as correspondence, or empty slogans urging endurance. Here, however, the letters seemed private, messy, and human. The scene gnawed at them. Guards who had the power of life and death treated paper like treasure. Cigarettes burned low, ashes dropping on scuffed floorboards, as men held words as if they were talismans. One soldier folded his letter slowly, slipping it back into his breast pocket, with a tenderness the women had never seen shown toward any uniform or weapon. That night, whispers filled the barracks. If paper could make soldiers forget war for a moment, what might those words say? And would any enemy dare share them? The answer came sooner than expected, when a guard did the unthinkable. He slid his fiancée's letter across the barbed wire. The following evening, as dusk smeared the sky in streaks of ash and violet, a group of women lingered near the fence. The guards paced slowly, rifles slung, but hands free. One soldier, tall and broad-shouldered, stood a little apart from the others. His fingers traced the edge of an envelope tucked into his jacket. He caught the gaze of a young German woman, hesitated, then, with a sudden decision, pulled the letter out. He glanced around, as if measuring risk, then crouched near the wire. The POW stepped closer, unsure whether to retreat. Without a word, he slid the folded paper through a gap in the mesh. The camp seemed to freeze. Boots paused mid-step, the buzz of the generator muted under the pounding silence. She picked up the envelope, trembling. Inside, the words carried the warmth of another world. Casual phrases from a fiancé, lines about weather, church picnics, and missing his touch. Nicknames appeared in looping cursive, surrounded by doodled hearts. Some envelopes were rumored to carry perfume still lingering from the sender's dress. It was nothing like the dry, bureaucratic front reports German families had received. These were alive, pulsing with personality. Military records show that while letters were technically subject to censorship, personal details often slipped through, creating small cracks of intimacy inside official war channels. For a prisoner who had been told that Americans were beasts, the shock was almost unbearable. She pressed the paper to her chest, whispering in disbelief, "This cannot be real." Other women crowded around her, begging to hear lines translated aloud. As she read, the barbed wire seemed to disappear. The war shrank to the size of a kitchen table in Kansas or a summer porch in Ohio. Tears streaked through grime on their faces. They had not cried this openly in years. The soldiers simply leaned back, lighting a cigarette, pretending nothing unusual had happened. Yet the act set a precedent. Within days, more guards began sliding letters across, cautiously at first, then more openly, as though the simple gesture carried more power than any weapon. By the next week, the barracks transformed into hushed reading circles. After roll call, clusters of women gathered beneath dim bulbs, clutching the borrowed letters as if they were sacred texts. Those with scraps of English translated word by word, their whispers punctuated by gasps and sudden sobs. Each sentence carried across accents and silences. Stories of waiting sweethearts, childhood jokes, confessions of longing scrawled in uneven ink. The atmosphere shifted from suspicion to fragile wonder. For women hardened by propaganda and hunger, the tenderness of phrases like "thinking of you every night" or "I will never stop waiting" was more shocking than rations. Tears cut through dirt-streaked cheeks. Hands shook as they passed the letters from one prisoner to another. They were not messages for them, and yet the emotions bled across borders. Scale made the moment even more incredible. The U.S. Army Postal Service was processing 6 to 10 million letters every single day in 1945. Entire fleets of planes and trucks were dedicated solely to carrying envelopes across oceans. To the German women, who had seen entire divisions starve for lack of supply, the idea that the enemy could mobilize such machinery for words and affection was staggering. One whispered in disbelief, "They showed us hearts instead of rifles." It was the opposite of everything they had been trained to expect. In the Reich, affection had been rationed as tightly as bread. Public love dismissed as weakness, grief hidden, tenderness suppressed under iron discipline. Now in captivity, their enemies revealed a different arsenal, letters that could soften even the most disciplined resolve. At night, when the guards paced and the floodlights hummed, some women pressed their eyes shut and imagined themselves in the places described: sunlit porches, small-town dances, fields stretching without ruins. The letters became doorways to a world that existed parallel to the devastation of Europe, a reminder that humanity could persist beyond rubble. But the shock did not end there, because soon the paper words were paired with something tangible, something edible that deepened the dissonance. It came in the form of parcels, bars of chocolate, and rations wrapped carefully with notes slipped inside. What began with words would soon mix with taste, and the combination would strike even harder. It began with a small, almost playful gesture. A guard broke a Red Cross parcel open in front of the women, peeled away the brown wrapping, and snapped off a square of chocolate. Instead of eating it, he slipped a folded note beneath the foil, wrapped it again, and slid the bar through the fence. The women stared as if it were a trick. One finally took it, peeled the wrapper, and found both sweetness and words inside. The first bite of real chocolate in years melted against her tongue, bittersweet and foreign. For many German civilians, cocoa had vanished from shelves as early as 1941, rationed to almost nothing by 1943. Now here it was, rich and overwhelming, paired with sentences written in hurried, affectionate scrawl. Some letters described ordinary things: weather back home, a neighbor's wedding, the smell of lilacs on a spring street. To the women, such details were as intoxicating as the sugar itself. Each Red Cross parcel contained about 12 ounces of chocolate and 50 cigarettes, alongside canned meat, powdered milk, and soap. But when a guard paired those contents with personal tokens, small notes, addresses, sometimes doodles, the effect multiplied. The women whispered to each other. Luxury was rationed even in Berlin. Now, behind barbed wire, they were tasting luxuries their own officers had denied them. The mixture of paper and food created a deeper fracture in their world view. Chocolate softened the bitterness of captivity, but the letters hidden within softened something else, the boundaries between victor and defeated. Every shared bite carried a message: you are human, and you are seen. It was nourishment for the body and dissonance for the mind. Even the guards seemed to understand the symbolism. Cigarettes traded hands not as currency, but as an accompaniment to paragraphs about love. When the women passed the bars around, breaking squares into careful halves, the rustle of paper and the sweetness of cocoa fused into one experience. They were eating kindness, something that no ration sheet in Nazi Germany had ever promised. And yet, as the parcels stacked higher and the letters circulated wider, the women began to wrestle with something heavier than hunger or desire. Because if their enemies could offer compassion in captivity, What did that say about everything they had believed before? The answer began to surface, not in food, but in whispers of doubt, and in the crumbling of propaganda they had once trusted. Nights in the barracks grew heavier, not from hunger, but from thought. The women lay on their bunks, clutching borrowed letters or nibbling the last crumbs of chocolate, and whispered in confusion. Everything they had been told back home, that Americans were cruel, greedy, without culture, collided with the evidence before their eyes. Acts of kindness cut sharper than punishment. Nazi propaganda had hammered for years that the Allies intended to enslave them, that capture meant degradation. Joseph Goebbels had filled newspapers, radio broadcasts, even children's storybooks with caricatures of American barbarity. By 1945, estimates suggest nearly 85% of German press output was controlled propaganda, designed to eliminate doubt. Yet inside the fence, the women tasted coffee, held perfume-scented letters, and shared chocolate given freely. The words and gestures of their captors dismantled years of indoctrination in days. Some whispered late at night, "They were not monsters." The phrase, almost forbidden, carried guilt. If the enemy could be kind, what did that mean about their own officers who had starved, beaten, and abandoned them? The mental clash was almost unbearable. Tears flowed not just from longing, but from a sense of betrayal by the system they had served. Every evening, when swing music drifted faintly from the guardroom radio, the whispers multiplied. For the first time, the women allowed themselves to question. If propaganda could lie about their enemies, what else had it hidden? The chocolate and the letters were small, ordinary things, but in them lay a revolution of thought. Guards seemed unaware of the storm they had stirred. To them it was routine, mail from home, parcels from Geneva, laughter around letters. To the women, it was an earthquake that shook the foundations of obedience and ideology. Captivity was supposed to break them. Instead, it rebuilt them in unexpected ways. This dissonance did not remain contained. It spread into camp culture, reshaping interactions, softening barriers, and making room for something no one had predicted: music, shared across wire and language. The first strains came on a windless night, when the hum of generators dropped and the camp seemed to breathe. From the guardroom drifted a low whistle, then the faint scratch of a record needle. A clarinet burst into life. Benny Goodman, the sound of swing carried across barbed wire. The German women froze in their bunks, unsure whether to laugh or cry. It was music unlike the martial marches drilled into them at rallies. This was playful, improvised, full of breath. The guards, off duty, sang softly with the record, tapping boots on floorboards, snapping fingers in rhythm. They didn't care if the POWs were listening, or perhaps they did. The women crowded near the slats of their barracks windows, pressing faces to the glass. Some hummed shyly along, trying to match notes they barely recognized. Others covered their faces because the music stripped away the last shield of indifference. By war's end, estimates show that over 16 million American servicemen had access to portable radios, phonographs, and stacks of records. Jazz and swing traveled with convoys, bombers, even field hospitals. To the German women, whose world had shrunk to silence, punctuated by orders, the idea that soldiers could bring entire soundscapes into captivity was another jarring revelation. One prisoner murmured, "Our music was silence." She wasn't exaggerating. Back in Germany, concerts had thinned as resources collapsed, and the regime condemned jazz as degenerate. Now, here in defeat, she was hearing the very rhythms her leaders had forbidden. The contradiction rang louder than the clarinet itself. Guards sometimes propped open windows so the sound would spill directly into the compound. It was not generosity so much as habit. They wanted their music, and the prisoners could not be excluded. Yet for the women, the experience felt like contraband smuggled into their barracks. They swayed on bunk edges, some mouthing words they didn't know, others clutching envelopes tighter, as if music and letters fused into one strange mercy. Music cracked the silence, but writing would pierce it deeper. Because as the notes faded and the record ended with a hiss, scraps of paper began to circulate, passed hand to hand, carrying words not from radios, but from their own pens. When the last swing notes faded into static, the camp fell quiet. But silence no longer felt natural. The women carried fragments of songs in their heads, and with them came a restless urge to answer. Not with music, they had no instruments, but with words of their own. One evening, a prisoner tore a strip of tar paper from the barracks wall. She flattened it, smoothed creases with the edge of her hand, and borrowed a stub of pencil from a sympathetic guard. Slowly, painfully, she began to draft a reply, not to the soldier himself, but to the letter he had shared. She wrote about what it felt like to read another woman's affection, how strange and piercing it had been. Her handwriting wavered, but the words came. Others followed. Scraps of cardboard, the backs of Red Cross labels, even ration wrappers became stationary. They knew censorship loomed over every line. Allied authorities screened outgoing POW mail to strip away propaganda and secrets. Yet, according to archival records, thousands of such letters from German prisoners, male and female, were collected and preserved. These fragments now sit in boxes, faded ink testifying to the hunger for expression. Inside the barracks, women whispered questions. Could words escape barbed wire? They feared their notes would be confiscated or mocked, but the urge to write was stronger than fear. The act itself was liberation. Each letter was a rebellion against the silence imposed by captivity and ideology alike. The guards responded in different ways. Some accepted the notes casually, folding them into breast pockets as if no rule had been broken. Others hesitated, unsure whether they were complicit in something dangerous. But the current of words could not be stopped. Letters multiplied, small and clumsy, yet filled with voices long suppressed. Every line carried risk and power. Risk because discovery could bring punishment. Power because each sentence bridged a gap, propaganda had tried to make unbridgeable. For the women, the act of writing back transformed them from passive receivers of kindness into active participants in dialogue. They were not only reading the enemy's humanity, they were offering their own in return. But with power came scrutiny, and soon the same envelopes that built bridges would land on the desks of censors, men tasked with deciding how much compassion was too much. The first bundles of POW letters did not travel far. They stopped at a wooden desk inside the command hut, where military police sorted incoming and outgoing mail. One evening, a sergeant lifted a stack of envelopes, some written on scraps of tar paper, others on Russian wrappers. His brow furrowed as he held them up to the lamp. These were not official forms, not neatly stamped Red Cross sheets, but improvised notes filled with emotion. He read slowly, lips moving. Phrases about longing, gratitude, even fragments of affection meant for no soldier in particular. Words spilling from women who were supposed to be enemies. Rules said censorship was mandatory. No unapproved correspondence should leave camp. Yet the sergeant sighed, flipped the letters over, and finally shrugged. He stamped them anyway. Archival data confirms the scale of this dilemma. Across U.S. camps holding German POWs, more than 500,000 prisoner letters were passed through censors during the war. Many contained complaints or coded attempts to smuggle information, but thousands also carried raw human sentiment. Deciding which words were dangerous and which were harmless fell to young officers barely trained for such moral weight. From the women's perspective, the fact that some of their notes slipped through was astonishing. Even their rules had mercy, one prisoner later reflected. For them, each letter allowed to travel felt like a victory against silence. Even if their words never reached the addressee, the act of being permitted to write and send them was proof that not all authority resembled the rigid cruelty of the Reich. But the censors' leniency stirred unease among the ranks. Some guards muttered that sharing letters blurred lines, that too much sympathy endangered discipline. They mocked fellow soldiers for playing postman to the enemy, for being soft in a world of barbed wire. The argument was not abstract. It flared in mess halls, over steaming coffee and tin plates of beans. The question lingered. Was kindness a breach of duty, or the very essence of it? And as resentment simmered, confrontations among the guards themselves became inevitable. The mess hall reeked of boiled beans and burnt coffee when the argument finally broke open. Guards hunched over tin trays, trading jokes, when one soldier pulled a folded German note from his pocket. He wasn't hiding it. He smoothed the paper openly, rereading a few lines. Across the table, another GI snorted, stabbing his fork into cornbread. "You gone soft," he muttered. The words cut louder than the clatter of trays. Conversation froze as others leaned in. The first guard bristled. "She wrote about her kids, that's all." The skeptic scoffed. "They're the enemy. You think they'd do the same for you?" His voice rose, drawing stares from every corner of the room. Fists clenched, trays rattled, and for a moment the war seemed to replay itself right there, American against American, over the question of compassion. Reports from U.S. Army disciplinary files note hundreds of conflicts among guards in POW camps, many sparked by blurred boundaries, sharing rations, trading cigarettes, even conversations deemed too friendly. These arguments often teetered on violence, exposing the strain of mixing military duty with daily human contact. From the German women's perspective, the tension was visible. They noticed when guards returned to the fence with split lips or sour moods, the aftermath of quarrels fought over them. One whispered, "They risked shame for kindness." The realization cut deep. The very men who had power over their survival were jeopardizing their standing, even their honor, to treat them as human beings. The division among guards hardened. Some tightened discipline, barking orders more sharply as if to prove loyalty. Others doubled down on gestures of empathy, offering cigarettes more openly, slipping notes with less hesitation. The conflict wasn't just about letters, it was about identity. Were they soldiers first, or men still connected to homes, families, and decency? That struggle would only grow sharper as the German women organized among themselves, pressured by leaders determined to preserve discipline and ideology within the barbed wire. The war inside the camp was about to turn inward. The barracks creaked under late-night whispers. Not all the women welcomed the flood of letters, chocolate, or music. A handful of senior figures, nurses who had served close to the party, clerks trained under strict supervision, gathered their peers into a corner of the dim hut. The meeting felt more like a tribunal than a conversation. Shadows stretched long as they whispered of duty, betrayal, and discipline. One woman, her uniform still pressed sharper than the rest, stood like a commander. "We must hold discipline," she insisted. Her voice was low but sharp, slicing through the murmurs. She warned that accepting enemy kindness was weakness, that reading foreign letters risked erasing their loyalty. Others nodded, uneasy. These leaders had absorbed the Reich's lessons deeply, and they tried to enforce the same structure inside captivity. Archival studies suggest that up to 15% of female German POWs had formal ties to the Nazi Party. They carried with them not only ideology, but authority, and they wielded it even behind barbed wire. For them, kindness was dangerous precisely because it was seductive. To allow hearts to soften meant conceding that years of propaganda had been lies. Better to forbid the letters, ban the songs, and restore rigid silence. Yet discipline cracked easily under hunger and grief. Younger women hid notes beneath straw mattresses or read them under blankets by candle stub. Even those who listened to the leaders in council later slipped back into the circles of translation, craving words of tenderness more than political slogans. The attempts to control felt brittle, like dried twigs snapping underfoot. Enemy kindness forced a split, loyalty to ideology on one side, longing for humanity on the other. The women caught in the middle suffered most, torn between fear of punishment by peers and the irresistible pull of letters that made them weep. One night, as the leaders scolded their group, music from the guardroom floated in again, an uninvited ally to the rebels. Heads bowed in defiance, but feet tapped under blankets. The council ended in silence, its authority undone not by words of resistance, but by a clarinet's echo. Discipline had been declared, but emotion was already winning, and soon the victory of feeling would spill into open tears.
Dusk settled over the camp, the sky streaked in copper and ash. Inside the barracks, the quiet broke not with whispers, but with sobs. A woman, who had hidden the letter beneath her straw mattress, finally unfolded it again, her hands trembling. She read a few lines aloud, simple phrases about missing Sunday dinners, about waiting for spring, and her voice cracked. The sound was contagious. Soon others wept with her, shoulders shaking, cheeks wet with streaks of salt cutting through dirt. What had begun in secrecy spread openly. Circles formed on the barracks floor, women sitting knee to knee, reading aloud words that weren't even written for them. Some cried silently, clutching their faces. Others let out gasps that echoed through the wooden walls. Guards passing outside paused, puzzled by the chorus of sobbing. The barbed wire had not kept grief contained. Psychological records from Allied studies later noted that POW morale improved by nearly 40% when mail was received regularly. For these women, the effect was even more profound. The letters were not their own, yet they gave permission to feel emotions long suppressed. Under the Reich, tears had been forbidden. Public grief was weakness. Private pain was policed. Now, inside captivity, enemies had unknowingly returned to them the ability to weep. One prisoner whispered through tears, "We had never been allowed to cry." The statement hung in the air, heavier than any speech or order. Crying together forged a fragile solidarity, not of ideology, but of shared humanity. The barracks became less a prison and more a confessional. Women spoke of husbands lost on the Eastern Front, of children evacuated, of cities reduced to rubble. The American letters served as triggers, unlocking their own buried memories. The catharsis was dangerous for the party loyalists, who saw their authority dissolve with every tear shed. Yet the momentum was unstoppable. The women's tears washed away fear of surveillance. Crying became trust, and trust cracked open space for conversations that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. The transformation was not complete, but the door had been opened. And as emotions spilled free, another stage followed. Bridges of laughter, language, and even small handshakes that crossed the wire itself. The days after the weeping, circles felt lighter, almost unrecognizable. Where silence had once ruled, cautious voices now bridged the gap between prisoner and guard. It began with small exchanges, broken English from the women, halting German from the soldiers. At first, it was just trading words for cigarettes, but soon it grew into something warmer. One afternoon, a guard approached the fence with a grin, trying to teach a prisoner the phrase apple pie. She repeated it awkwardly, her accent twisting the vowels. The mistake sent both of them into laughter. For the women, laughter was as new and startling as the tears had been. Soon others joined in, tossing words back and forth across the barbed wire, testing sounds like children learning language. The moments accumulated. A soldier shook a prisoner's hand through the mesh, a gesture as risky as it was simple. Another offered chewing gum, exaggerating how to stretch it until she laughed at her own clumsiness.
These were not grand acts of mercy, but daily gestures that chipped away at walls built by ideology and fear. The scale of such interactions was not unique to this camp. By 1946, more than 425,000 German POWs in the United States experienced similar encounters, working on farms, exchanging jokes with guards, or joining in small cultural exchanges. What happened in this barracks was part of a broader pattern, a quiet rewriting of enemy lines through proximity and humanity. From the women's perspective, the change was profound. We saw enemies as men, one recalled years later. The phrase captured the collapse of propaganda and the rise of something else, recognition. These were not faceless invaders or caricatures from leaflets, but young men with families, humor, and flaws. Trust rebuilt slowly, but it rebuilt nonetheless. The same barbed wire that had once symbolized fear now marked the boundary of a strange sanctuary, where humanity, not brutality, defined captivity. Yet the power of those moments would only be fully understood later, when the war was over and memory had the final word. Because the letters, the tears, and the laughter did not fade with release. They traveled home inside survivors' testimonies, remembered longer than fences or rations. And that leads to the closing chapter, the letters themselves, and how they were carried forward into history. Decades after the war, when the fences had long been dismantled and the camps forgotten by most, the memories that endured were not of guard towers or rations. Survivors, now elderly, sat for interviews or wrote in memoirs, and the stories that surfaced again and again were of paper, creases, ink, perfume lingering faintly across time. They remembered the letters more vividly than the fences that had enclosed them. Archives in Europe and America hold testimonies where women described the shock of those envelopes. They spoke less of fear and more of words that arrived like contraband hope. Some remembered chocolate melting on their tongues, paired with a folded note. Others recalled reading aloud in circles, their voices trembling as the foreign words unlocked hidden grief. These details survived the decades because they had been seared into memory during a moment when the world seemed stripped of all tenderness. Historians estimate that as many as 40,000 German POW memoirs reference acts of Allied compassion, ranging from food parcels to letters and music. Among female accounts, the most striking theme was the collapse of propaganda under the weight of kindness. The letters became proof that humanity had outlasted ideology. One former prisoner reflected simply, "Those words saved parts of us." In museums and archives, some of those fragile sheets of paper remain. Faded ink, clumsy English, doodles in margins. They are silent now, yet they carry the same shock they did when first passed through barbed wire. To hold them today is to glimpse the small rebellions of empathy that altered the course of individual lives inside a global war. The legacy is not sentimental fantasy, it is documented transformation. Women who had been taught to hate left captivity with fractured certainties, some even carrying seeds of respect for the very men they had been told were monsters. Letters turned from private messages into bridges across enmity. And so, when memory finally chose what to preserve, it was not the image of rifles or the sound of boots in mud. It was the crackle of paper unfolding, the laughter carried in ink, and the tears released in circles of women. The war had been fought with weapons, but for these captives it was remembered for letters.